What's up, guys? Welcome back to Newswave. This weekend was the launch for Concord, which was Sony's latest live service endeavor, and it's been downright disastrous for it, as people have been keeping an eye on and even announcing at times what the live player count was. Seems like Sony's gonna have to figure something out, because now people are wondering how much longer the thing's even gonna be supported, despite it just coming out a couple of days ago. We'll go over that, though, here today. Also, we are gonna be talking about what appears to be a Nintendo Direct happening this week. At least there's much more interest in this possibility after another source threw their hat in the ring. And I'll also be talking about the follow-up to Crash Bandicoot 4. I'm sure there are many Crash fans out there that are wondering what would have been next for Toys for Bob, and well, prepare to be annoyed. So if you guys enjoy these videos, make sure you hit that like button, helps out a ton. And if new here to the Spawn Wave channel, make sure you subscribe down below. And of course, members for the channel do get Newswave early. If you'd like to learn more about that, click the join button down below this video. And we're gonna start today with Valve and Deadlock, which was their quote-unquote secret project that somehow 20-some-odd thousand people were playing at any given time. Now, it was done through invite only, but it was very easy to get the invites. Now, though, Valve, after yelling at The Verge a week ago, have made it public knowledge. Yeah, you've never heard of this before, I'm sure, but we can see over on Steam, Deadlock. The page is live. It's a multiplayer game in early development. In fact, they say it has lots of temporary art and experimental gameplay. And it's currently still limited to friend invites via our play testers. Now, it's very easy, obviously, to get in, because if you look on the concurrent player count number, it spiked to nearly 90,000 players after this announcement happened. And it's apparently it's a hero shooter mixed sort of with a MOBA, so it seems like Valve just kind of playing around with an idea that they have for a game, and that's kind of it right now. But it's garnered a ton of interest because it's Valve developing a game, which is not as frequent, I guess, as it used to be back in the day. So I guess if you want to get in, you can get a hold of somebody who's currently playing, and they can throw you a request. Or it also seems that Valve is just sending invites out randomly, so you might just get one, I guess, on Steam or in your email. But if you've been curious, yeah, keep an eye out, because Deadlock, it's not exactly difficult or really much of a secret anymore to play. Also, we had a major sale of a vintage piece over on Heritage Auction that made the news, and I mean, you can see it here. Yeah, it's that Super Nintendo, or that Nintendo PlayStation controller. Now, the funny thing about this is they mentioned in the listing that they have no way to really test it. Like, they don't have, I guess, the PlayStation Nintendo, Super Nintendo PlayStation to try it out with at this time. That had previously sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars years ago. And I guess they also just have a controller here that they were selling. $35,000, by the way, on this. I guess the way it's set up, you could probably test it, I guess, on just a Super Nintendo. It's just, I guess, interesting to see Sony and the PlayStation logo next to the Super Famicom logo there, and of course the colored buttons. Again, a piece of history and almost a one of one. The thing with that, though, remember, it was found in an attic randomly one day, and then it showed up on Reddit. So I guess you never know who else out there has a Nintendo PlayStation just sitting up in their attic in a couple of boxes, or maybe a controller like this. At least for now, though, it's worth $35,000. So you might want to go check just to make sure. Oh, and if you missed it to close out the week, we did have sales numbers that were revealed to us from Game Science for Black Myth Wukong. We can see over on their official account. This says Black Myth Wukong has sold 10 million copies across all platforms. This, by the way, in its first 3 days on the market. They also mentioned 3 million concurrent players across all platforms. We know that the PlayStation 5, probably around the 650,000 mark or so, as Steam topped roughly 2.4 million players at any given time, which is super impressive. But 10 million across 3 days places it in a very rare category here, with things like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I mean, it's above Elden Ring and Hogwarts Legacy, so very, very impressive stuff here for Black Myth Wukong. There's a discussion around where the sales are coming from. Is it like majority China? Is it in the Western audience? Doesn't really matter at the end of the day. A sale is a sale, and yes, I would wager a bet that most of the traffic is coming from China, but again, money's money. A sale is a sale, and I'm sure they're very happy either way with, yeah, 10 million in the first 3 days. And guys, with some of the quick news out of the way, let's get into the bigger stuff. Let's start right away with Concord. Now, this came out in early access last week. I think it was like the same day as Black Myth Wukong. And I know Black Myth Wukong isn't a multiplayer game, but it certainly absorbed a lot of the spotlight in gaming, to the point where I'm sure many people even just completely forgot about Concord, even though many people necessarily weren't thinking about it, but just forgot about it and were looking completely at Black Myth Wukong that day. But you could have got in for, I think, $60 and got a head start. 3 days later, on the 23rd, the game released at $40, and we had a look at a few things. One, the Metacritic score, which you can see here, sitting at a 66. So not exactly great with just critics in general here, and even the user score, 2.7, which that's based on 229 user ratings, and I have a feeling many of them just haven't played the game, one based on some of the reviews and the point they're trying to get across, but also, I mean, if you kind of extrapolate that across how many people maybe have bought the game from concurrent player count, I just don't think that's even possible there, even with 229 user ratings. But after this, people did take a look at how it was doing on Steam specifically, and its all-time peak is 697 players. So yeah, unfortunately, it didn't even crack 1,000 players on Steam. And I've seen it bounce around as low as like 150 people on at any given time. And when you get to that level, you're going to start running into issues of just finding matches. And that's the biggest thing, because that can lead to a cascading effect of people just logging off and then kind of a spiral for the game to zero. But people, of course, then took this information and said, okay, well, how did some of the worst games we've seen recently do in concurrent player count numbers, specifically the peak? So Lord of the Rings Gollum, which, not a great game, right? Obviously. Yeah, the all-time peak for that was 758 players. So about 60 players more than Concord. And if you look at Suicide Squad, which, again, many people said, okay, that's just a terrible game, 13,459 for the all-time peak concurrent player count. And I just want to harp on this again. These are specifically Steam numbers. We don't know how many players are currently on the PS5, which obviously the other platform it launched on, as this was a simultaneous release for Sony. But these are the numbers we can actually see. And something tells me, even if the numbers for the PS5 were significantly higher than this, I mean, if you multiplied this by 10, it still wouldn't be to the level where you'd go, okay, I think that's fine. I think they're in a good spot here for it. Because this looks rough right now for Concord. And I will say, when Sony announced that they were going to attempt 12 live service games, which they have cut down since then, I think most of us looked around and realized, okay, not all these live service games are going to be successful, but I think most of us figured that meant if it wasn't successful, it wasn't going to make it out of the development phase and eventually come to market. Concord did, and we are seeing a massive, I would just say, disaster, and people are saying it's one of the worst launches we've ever seen from Sony, and especially on the multiplayer side, because people just aren't interested in the game, and there's so many reasons getting thrown around as to why the game is struggling. I mean, the biggest reason is it's a hero shooter that have characters that are just uninteresting. That's it. I played the closed beta, I played the open beta, and I don't remember any of the characters' names. I remember one, and the reason I remember one was like the Star Child. It's because they reminded me of like the character from Guardians of the Galaxy, which not even Concord, like from a different intellectual property completely. So it just doesn't stand on its own at this point, and there's just so many other options in the marketplace that are also free to play. So it's just going to struggle regardless. And if this is what we're seeing launch weekend, I don't think it's going to get much better. Like, this might be the high point for it, and we might see it dip below 100 players, 50 players, and then the game itself is just going to struggle to exist because it needs players. Like, that's it. The player count has to be high enough to support multiplayer sessions. We just talked about Deadlock. 90,000 players, just about, is where it peaked, and it's sitting around 50 to 60,000. You're going to be perfectly fine with those numbers, but with Concord, not so much. This has led people to wonder, how can Sony fix this? And they could throw it in a PlayStation Network and maybe even come up with a light version, quote unquote, of Concord, where you have to unlock all the different characters and some content, but you get it for free. And the people who bought the game just already have all the characters anyway. But I think we should get to a point where we realize, you know what? Not all these games are going to work out, and some will struggle and just outright fail, and maybe that is the way Sony should look at this. Just move on from Concord completely, and maybe have Firewalk do just something else completely different for their next game. That would be the only issue we'd run into here, is Sony now owns Firewalk. They seemingly bought them because of this game, which is questionable as it is. But maybe instead of completely dissolving what I think is at least a talented studio, maybe have them do something different and try again. Just not a hero shooter that would have made a lot more sense 7 years ago. Next up, let's talk about the potential for a Nintendo Direct this week. Now, this, of course, still kicking around kind of in the rumors and speculation territory, but I am becoming more and more confident that, yes, there will be some sort of Nintendo event this week, which is exciting because typically we would look another 2 weeks or so down the road into September for some sort of sizable Direct. Is it possible that Nintendo has maybe moved things up a bit a few weeks like PH Brazil had mentioned? Well, we can see this from Nate Drake, Nate the Hate, over on Famaboards. He's always over there. Says, we will see Nintendo coverage soon. Whether said coverage is linked to a Direct or not, I cannot be sure based on the expected timeline. He would then post, 3 hours later, just saying, my expectation is a Direct. This is after being asked, okay, where were your expectations? Were they set? And I will say, I think in this case, Nate getting information maybe about a couple of reveals or something, trying to piece together, is this the direction Nintendo would go, in the sense that they are going to have a full-scale Direct this week. And, you know, it is hard to say, because if you find out about 2 games maybe that are being revealed, you go, okay, maybe that would be thrown in Direct. Could be a partner Direct, very possible. Could be a full-scale Direct, but the fact that it's not, oh yeah, it's probably something for the new Zelda game coming up. Okay, they could do a treehouse around that. Doesn't really seem to be the case anymore, and it also doesn't seem to be Indie World based on what PH Brazil had said before, and they're the ones who were like, yeah, that stuff's being moved up. So now, I am anticipating a Direct to happen this week, and let's say it happens on Wednesday, would they announce it Tuesday? Or if it's a partner Direct, would they just show up and release it just randomly one morning? So I think that's where my expectation is currently. A partner Direct to allow third parties to maybe just make some announcements ahead of Tokyo Game Show. Even though this is very far ahead, we are seeing different companies now sort of set the stage for their presence at Tokyo Game Show, and maybe Nintendo's like, you know what, we'll just go ahead and get this stuff going now, and then over the next few weeks, we'll also talk about a few things which, yes, could eventually include their new system. As I mentioned, going into something like October, it would actually start to make sense for them to at least discuss it in some way, whether it's a trailer or something. So I wouldn't necessarily expect there to be Switch 2 talk at all with this Direct coming up this week, but we'll see if Nintendo makes that reply tweet like they tend to do a lot now, or like, oh yeah, there's no next-gen discussion here. If it's not at the bottom of that Direct announcement, if they make one, okay, then maybe we can start to expect something. Or maybe they decide to do a revision for the current Switch to lower the price and maybe push more units this holiday, and that would allow them to get to the 13.5 million systems they still have forecasted, which they might want to start selling a few more systems to get there, because right now they are tracking quite a bit behind that, but we'll see. It could be an exciting week coming up. Next up, let's talk about Avowed, as it was present at Gamescom. In fact, many people got a chance to go hands-on, and there were some very good previews that were put out. I saw Mr. Matty Plays, for example, had discussed it, and he's very into a lot of the Obsidian stuff, and I was interested to see what he had to say about it, and seemed like he was very positive coming away from his experience. But he also was on the Iron Lord podcast talking with developers for Avowed, and unfortunately, despite all the positive and coverage and excitement for Avowed, the thing that really caught the headlines had to do with the performance target on the Xbox console. We can see this quote that was put up, this over on Pure Xbox. Says, performance is one of the last things we figure out, right? Our core target is 30 frames per second bare minimum. That's the expectation. It's a first-person, single-player game. You don't necessarily need that 60 frames. And that allows us to get a lot juicier with the effects, lighting, and all this other stuff. It's a trade-off we opted to make relatively early, and we're really happy about that. I mean, the game's running pretty smooth for how visually dense it is, and that was always our goal. As far as a greater understanding of performance spec, we're still figuring all of that out. It's one of the last things you do. So I do want to point out that that last sentence, they're still looking at it in terms of performance, and doesn't necessarily rule out the idea of there being a 60 FPS or a performance mode where maybe they just uncap the frame rate with VRR and hope that it sits close to that 60 FPS target. But it does appear they set out as like, okay, 30 frames per second is fine. And it's still strange to me that we have that sort of thinking in the industry with developers and stuff, because I feel like I've seen more and more of a shift, especially with the start of the PS5 and the Xbox Series generation, to where people did get like a taste of 60 frames per second for some of these PS4 and Xbox One games that already looked good enough, but now they look really smooth and are very responsive, to where, they want 60 FPS for as many games as possible. I mean, in a perfect world, we would have bare minimum 60 FPS for everything. I understand that's not always possible because, as is mentioned here, developers and publishers, they like to show the games off with high fidelity and really cool effects, because I know people don't necessarily like to hear this, but that's the easiest way to sell a game to the mainstream, who apparently don't really take things off fidelity mode often, if that is default. It sounds weird, I'm sure, to some of you who maybe jump over to performance immediately, but there have been discussions with higher ups at, big publishers, EA, Take-Two, and more, that are like, yeah, we find that fidelity mode is chosen majority of the time by players. So when you hear that, you go, okay, well, I understand why that's the target, but I think when you hear first person, you start to think about 60 FPS over everything, and then you're like, oh, do you need that? Yes, because then it feels very unresponsive and like you're underwater at times, depending on the performance, when big visual effects maybe are popping up. So my thought is maybe down the road they have a patch that gets it to 60 frames per second. It seems like it might be a little late now based on the game coming out to start off 2025, but we saw it with Redfall and we saw it with Starfield. Eventually they got a 60 FPS patch, despite at times saying the 30 FPS mode was a creative decision. I don't know if I really believe that after a patch comes through, so maybe Avowed will follow a similar trajectory, or maybe they get it in right at launch, we'll see. And then our last bit of news, let's talk about Crash Bandicoot 5, as of course we did have Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, and it was actually a really good 3D platformer. Yeah, I liked it, and I was curious to see what would be next in the series with Toys for Bob, and then we saw what happened with Microsoft and the studio, where it seemed like Toys for Bob broke off, became an independent studio, but then also has a contract with Microsoft to make something else that we haven't really heard of yet, but maybe it's new IP, maybe it's something Crash or Spyro related. But we did have an entire report on this, and it is a very well done video over on Digino Gaming by Liam Robertson, who I had a feeling was going to be digging into this story a bit, and well, if you're a big Spyro and Crash fan, you're probably not necessarily going to like what you're about to hear, but we'll actually take a look. This is also reported by VGC. We can see they say, Toys for Bob set a small group of developers the task of envisioning the future of the series, a project they'll be referred to internally as Crash Bandicoot 5. This would have been a single-player 3D platform and a direct sequel to Crash 4, It's About Time. Gets better. One supposed concept even saw Crash team up with Spyro following an interdimensional threat to both worlds. According to the report, Crash and Spyro were intended to be two playable characters in the same game. Wow, somebody just punched their monitor somewhere over that, but I will say the video that was published over on Digino Gaming is like an hour and 15 minutes long. It is incredibly thorough with the research, the concept art. There's even like video of some of the game apparently that's being shown. So if you're really interested to see what could have been and the crossover we almost had for Crash and Spyro fans, absolutely check it out. But I will say it is a shame because I do think Crash 4 was good, and it felt like they were even going to take things to the next level, as we're hearing about here with Crash 5, but Activision, of course, they like their live service stuff, and as we saw just from the outside, it seemed like it was all hands on deck for Call of Duty. I was even shocked we got Crash 4, so hearing about the reasoning around maybe why Crash 5 didn't happen, because, there's some levels that had to undergo some testing or maintenance for Call of Duty. Well, we use Crash 5 when you have that cash cow rolling along. But definitely check out the video. I'll have it linked down below. And before we go to the comment of the day, we'll take a look at the poll that I posted up yesterday, where I ask, a big Microsoft first-party game just came out. Where are you playing it? I had a hard time wording this originally, so I put the poll up again. I'm trying to make it so that people understand that I'm saying, look, even if you're not interested, where would you play it? But most of the time, people are just like, where's the option for I don't care. Anyway, PC is 58%, Xbox console 42%. And I get it. When you hear that interview with Avowed developers, you're like, well, my PC should be able to get this thing to 60 frames per second. And then when you hear with the previews, they were playing them on PC anyway because they're showing it at 60 frames per second. It's like, okay, hold on a minute. Are we sure 30 FPS is a creative decision? Or is it just that's what we could get out of the consoles right this second? Again, a patch probably come later, as we saw with Redfall and with Starfield, but like, at least I guess they're somewhat open about it. Hey, we wanted 30 FPS because we wanted things to look better with the graphics. I feel like at 60 FPS, people would still be okay with the graphics being turned down somewhat to get a smoother experience. And we'll finish up with the comment of the day, as you're seeing here. This is from Kasuke saying, I find it funny that these games are taking so long to be made that time literally passes the trend they were chasing. That's the biggest issue right now with game development and live service. It doesn't match up. The live service sector is way too fluid right now. Things change constantly. And game development, as we heard with Concord, 8 years. While I'm sure a sizable chunk was more or less pre-production and conceptualization, still, I mean, at that point, when you get to halfway through, it's like, all right, time to go into full production. It's too late to change everything you did leading up to that. So, I mean, the amount of time it took them to make Concord, people could have gone through high school twice. Think about that for a minute. It's wild stuff, and I think that's why these companies have to rethink the way they approach live service in general. Not 8-year development cycles, maybe 3-year development cycles, then have it out there as this beta that just runs for a while and gathers feedback, maybe even for years. And ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it here for Newswave. If you enjoyed this video, guys, hit that like button. If not, hit the dislike. Leave comments down below about everything we talked about here today. If you missed last week's Newswave on Friday, I'll have a link next to me in the cards. Or maybe you want to take a trip back to the past and take a look at an old EGM magazine from the 90s where I found all kinds of, we'll say, interesting articles. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.